This barbaric ritual was so extreme that even the darkest entertainment districts of ancient Rome banned it. Yet in the heart of the Byzantine Empire on the vast hippodrome of Constantinople, it was performed every night before tens of thousands of spectators, many of whom shouted with enthusiasm as children as young as 10 were thrown to the mercy of an unimaginable fate. There, amid the roar of the crowd and the glow of torches, a practice was repeated that today can only be described as a mixture of cruel spectacle, public humiliation, and systemic abuse. It was called Leda and the Swan. The scene was disturbing. A naked child lay on the stage while trained animals performed acts that would provoke universal horror today. 80,000 spectators clapped, laughed, and threw coins that clinked against the naked skin of the girl, turned into a human commodity. This was no ordinary spectacle. It was legalized human trafficking, institutionalized and supported by a political system that transformed children's suffering into a profitable show. Among those victims was a girl who would soon become the most powerful and terrifying figure of her time. Her name was Theodora, and what began as a childhood nightmare marked by humiliation and exploitation transformed into the forge of the most formidable empress in history. Her fate was sealed by the premature death of her father, a mere bear trainer, in the service of the hippodrome's political factions, which led her to a life where abuse became her school and humiliation her lesson. How was it possible that the suffering of an abandoned girl turned into the most sophisticated weapon of manipulation in antiquity? How did a cruel spectacle despised even by the Romans shape a woman capable of unleashing a massacre of 30,000 people and altering the course of the Byzantine Empire's history? This is a disturbing tale of how Byzantium's most horrific sexual practices not only destroyed childhoods, but created an unprecedented predator. A story in which a victim learned to use the poison of her own pain to rule exact revenge and leave a trail of blood and power that still echoes in history. It all began with the death of a seemingly insignificant man whose consequences set off a tragic fate for his entire family. His name was Acacius, known in Constantinople as the Keeper of Bears. His job was to train massive brown beasts that fought in the hippodrome arena before the roar of 80,000 spectators. It was not an insignificant role. In the rigid structure of Byzantine society, every profession was tied to one of the two factions that dominated city life, the Blues and the Greens. These factions were not mere sports teams supporting chariot races. They were true political parties that controlled employment favors, spectacles, and even administrative positions. Every citizen belonged to one of them, and that affiliation determined the entire course of their life. Acacius belonged to the Greens, and thanks to his position, his wife and 3 daughters had a roof over their heads and means to live. At least that's what the rules dictated. But when Acacius suddenly died, that entire order collapsed. According to tradition, his position should have automatically passed to his family to ensure their survival. However, greed and corruption stood in the way. Asterius, the dance master of the Greens, an influential man who decided employment in the entertainment world, accepted a bribe. Instead of passing the position to the rightful heir, he gave it to another man. With one corrupt act, 3 young girls were condemned to starvation, or worse, to the most sophisticated machine of child exploitation in the ancient world. Theodora's mother, a widow and desperate, faced an impossible choice: watch her daughters die of hunger, or surrender them to a brutal system that turned innocence into a commodity. She chose survival, though the price was unimaginable. What followed was a spectacle of calculated humiliation. The woman dressed her 3 little girls in garlands of supplication laurel wreaths, symbolizing pleas and submission, and led them to the center of the hippodrome. There, before tens of thousands of spectators, she offered her daughters like objects of pity, presenting them to the audience and begging for mercy. But everyone understood the message: these girls were available for the darkest purposes of Byzantine entertainment. The Greens, directly responsible for their misfortune, turned away from them with absolute indifference. The Blues, the rival faction, took pity and granted a small position to their new stepfather. In that moment, Theodora's memory was shaped. She never forgot who betrayed her and who showed a shred of mercy. Years later, that memory would guide her revenge with ruthless precision. By the age of 10, Theodora was already part of a depraved mechanism that defied imagination. The most infamous spectacle she had to perform in was the so-called Leda, and the swan inspired by a Greek myth, but transformed into a nightmare. Naked on the stage, she had to remain motionless, while trained geese pecked at grains scattered on her skin, and a crowd of aroused men clapped and threw coins at her childish body. It was a scene that any modern legal system today would recognize as organized and systematic abuse of minors. But in 6th century Byzantium, it was not a crime, it was legalized entertainment. The law itself decreed that every actress or performer in the hippodrome was equivalent to a prostitute. Physical submission was not only expected, it was an imposed obligation. Thus a girl, who should have been learning to read and write, was thrust into a world where her body was the only currency and her innocence was fodder for an insatiable crowd. What set Theodora apart from many other victims was the way she faced the tragedy. While many girls broke under the unbearable pressure she observed and learned, she discovered that pain could become a weapon, that humiliation revealed the hidden weaknesses of the men who exploited her, and that every spectacle was not only degradation, but also a masterclass in human psychology. Thus, Theodora's childhood, marked by betrayal and corruption, did not destroy her, but transformed her into someone capable of turning exploitation into knowledge. And that perverse education became the foundation of a woman who would soon terrify an empire. By the age of 10, Theodora's life no longer resembled that of an ordinary girl. What should have been a childhood filled with games and basic learning became a daily nightmare. Every night she had to step onto the hippodrome stage and perform the macabre act known as Leda and the Swan. There, in the glow of torches and under the gaze of thousands of eyes, she stripped naked and lay on the sand. Then trained geese began pecking at barley grains scattered on her skin. The audience, composed of senators, merchants, and sensation-hungry citizens, responded with deafening applause and a shower of coins that fell like gleaming projectiles onto her fragile body. For the crowd, it was entertainment, a curious spectacle, blending eroticism, cruelty, and eccentricity. For Theodora, it was the beginning of a brutal education. She quickly realized that this grotesque performance was only a prelude. The worst came later. In the hidden corridors of the hippodrome were the same men who threw coins demanded intimate services. Byzantine law was clear and cruel. Every woman performing on stage was automatically considered a prostitute. This meant that for Theodora, abuse was not only expected, but imposed and sanctioned. The psychological toll was devastating. A girl her age should have been learning to read, write, or recite simple poems. Instead, she was discovering how carnal desires could transform the most powerful men into pathetic creatures willing to grovel for a moment of pleasure. What was pain for others became knowledge for her. She began mentally cataloging every gesture, every glance, every weakness that men revealed in moments of intimacy. The hippodrome became her university. Every performance was a masterclass in human psychology. She observed how senators who made laws by day lost all dignity in the darkness of private rooms. She studied how merchants controlling entire caravans became desperate and pitiful when it came to satisfying their fantasies. Gradually, she understood that power lay not only in money or politics, but in the ability to manipulate these intimate weaknesses. While other girls sank into despair, Theodora developed an analytical, cold, and observant mind. She could instantly sense which words to use to excite a man, which gesture to repeat to make him feel special, which silence was more unsettling than 1,000 words. It wasn't about pleasure, but control. She learned to reverse the dynamic between victim and exploiter, becoming a calculated observer. The years between 10 and 16 marked Theodora's metamorphosis. She became the most desired performer in the hippodrome, not only for her young body, but for her subtle intelligence. The same men who threw coins at her nakedness when she was a child now paid increasingly large sums to have her exclusively. They thought they were buying the body of a degraded actress, but in reality they were feeding the mind of a strategist in the making. Unbeknownst to them, they were shaping their future executioner. Those 6 years were undoubtedly a school of exploitation. Every humiliation became information, every abuse transformed into data about how those in power could be reduced to fragile beings. Theodora learned that desire was the most dangerous chink in the armor of the powerful, and that when wielded correctly, it could become a weapon more fearsome than an army. By the time she reached 16, she was no longer a child, but a young woman marked by barbarity yet armed with knowledge no one else possessed. She had survived where others perished, learned where others only suffered, and was ready to move to the next stage to stop being a passive victim and become a predator. The next chapter of Theodora's life began with an offer that at first glance seemed like salvation. Hecabolism. A Syrian governor of Libya and one of the most powerful men in the empire came to Constantinople seeking entertainment and pleasure. When he saw Theodora in the hippodrome, he wasn't satisfied with one night, he wanted to possess her fully. He offered her the chance to become his personal concubine. For a young girl who had been exploited by crowds for 6 years, it seemed like a chance to escape the infernal cycle. So at just 16, Theodora accepted the offer and was whisked away to the governor's luxurious palace in North Africa. For 4 years, she lived among marble silks and feasts. But Theodora didn't let comfort lull her. She understood that this new stage was a continuation of her education. If the hippodrome was her first school, Hecabolis's palace became her higher academy. Every intimate encounter with the governor turned into a lesson in applied psychology. She discovered which desires shamed him, which fantasies made him lose control, and which emotional voids reduced him to a desperate man. She analyzed how even someone who ruled provinces and commanded armies became fragile when he felt dependent on her. Hecabolis thought he controlled a sexual slave, but in reality he was unwittingly shaping a woman who would one day challenge an entire empire. Theodora learned that true power didn't lie in possessing wealth or armies, but in controlling the most intimate desires of those who did. However, she made a mistake. She began directly influencing her patron's political decisions. When the governor discovered that his policies were being manipulated by his concubine's charms, he erupted in fury. One night, amid insults and shouts, Hecabolis threw her out of the palace, tossing her belongings onto the scorching Libyan desert sand, leaving her alone under the blazing sun. After 4 years of luxury, Theodora found herself back in the abyss alone and humiliated. Yet this betrayal, instead of destroying her, became her greatest lesson. She learned that power dependent on one man could vanish in an instant, and that the only way to survive was to build her own independent, unbreakable control. Her journey back to Constantinople was an odyssey of resilience. To pay for her passage, Theodora sold her body on merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean. But she was no longer a helpless girl. Every encounter was an opportunity to hone her psychological arsenal. She conversed with merchants extracting secrets of their trade that she later used to her advantage. She gained the trust of captains, learning smuggling routes and memorizing information that could prove useful later. Every man who thought he was exploiting her became in reality the subject of her studies, another rung on her ladder to power. In Alexandria, Theodora found a new place of transformation. She adopted monophysite Christianity, but more than a spiritual awakening, it was a strategic political move. This faith gave her an independent base of support, free from the prostitution system that had marked her. She learned to present herself not only as a cunning courtesan, but also as a pious woman, capable of attracting both religious devotion and desire. In Antioch, a pivotal encounter occurred. There she met Macedonia, a performer tied to the blues faction, who relayed information to Constantinople. From her, Theodora learned that a 40-year-old Prince Justinian was inquiring about a former hippodrome dancer who had survived Libya. Theodora's fame preceded her. Stories of a young woman who manipulated a governor, endured humiliations, and knew the weaknesses of the powerful like no one else circulated throughout the empire. As her ship approached the golden domes of Constantinople, Theodora realized she was no longer returning as a victim. Years of exploitation had transformed her into a patient and calculated predator. The girl naked on the sand was gone. In her place returned a woman armed with deadly knowledge how to destroy men from within their desires. It was the year 522 when Theodora, at just 20 years old, returned to Constantinople, the city that had once seen her humiliated as a child in the hippodrome. Now it beheld her transformed into a woman aware of her power. She had survived what would have destroyed anyone else, and returned armed with knowledge as dark as it was effective. She knew how desires could manipulate will, how pleasure could overcome reason, and how emotional dependence was stronger than any law. At one of the court's private gatherings, Prince Justinian saw her for the first time. He was 40 and the heir to a crumbling empire rife with political intrigue and social tensions. To him, Theodora was initially just a former hippodrome performer. He didn't know he was facing a woman who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of intimate manipulation. The seduction began immediately, but it wasn't mere infatuation. It was a silent battlefield, where Theodora applied every technique learned through years of degradation. She analyzed Justinian with the same cold precision she used on senators and merchants. She quickly discovered his weakness for intelligent conversation in intimate moments, a skill she had honed with merchants on Mediterranean ships. She also noticed his need to be emotionally understood, a trait she had seen in Hesebolas, the governor of Libya, whom she had made dependent on her attention. Nothing she did was random. Every gesture, every word, every silence was calculated to deepen his obsession. Justinian quickly fell under her spell. To him, Theodora was not just a desirable woman, but an enigma offering both intellect and sensuality, tenderness and mystery. He thought he was choosing the woman of his life, but in reality he was being programmed to depend on her. When Justinian expressed his intent to marry Theodora, the court erupted in scandal. Senators couldn't believe it. The heir to the Byzantine Empire, the future emperor, wanted to tie his life to a woman who had performed naked before crowds, participated in degrading spectacles, and was legally considered a prostitute. To many it was unthinkable, but the more resistance he faced, the more Justinian doubled down on his decision. His obsession consumed him, and his desire to possess her outweighed any political considerations. The greatest obstacle, however, was not the Senate, but the reigning empress, Euphemia, wife of Emperor Justin. Euphemia knew the value of personal dignity, having once been a slave herself before rising to power. She recognized in Theodora a threat others didn't see. "I climbed from slavery," she declared before the court, "but I was never a prostitute." Her words were a direct accusation, a frontal rejection of the possibility of Theodora entering the imperial circle. For months, Euphemia blocked any legal initiatives that could enable the marriage. She banned Theodora from official events and maneuvered to keep her at bay. Then in the year 523, something unexpected happened. Euphemia died suddenly in her bed. There were no prior signs of illness or witnesses to explain her death. To many it was a coincidence. To others it was a quiet application of the knowledge Theodora had gained in her youth. Among the hippodrome's surviving prostitutes, secrets circulated about sleep-inducing herbs, traceless poisons and methods simulating natural death. No one could prove anything, but the suspicion lingered forever. Euphemia's death opened the way. Emperor Justinian's uncle, promptly promulgated a law allowing men of noble birth to marry actresses. The law seemed written with Theodora in mind. In the year 525, in the Hagia Sophia Basilica, the wedding took place. The place that once marked her as an outcast now welcomed her with the honors of an empress. Every step toward the altar was a theatrical act laden with symbolism. She was no longer the naked girl on the hippodrome sand, but a woman clad in imperial purple. Yet in essence, the performance was the same, a calculated spectacle to show she had triumphed. She had turned exploitation into triumph, humiliation into power. This marriage was not merely a man's love for a woman, it was the institutionalization of intimate manipulation as a political tool. The empire was to be ruled by a couple united not only by ambition, but by the emperor's obsessive dependence on a woman who controlled him. Theodora's marriage to Justinian was not met with calm. To many it was unbearable that a woman who had been a hippodrome performer, legally deemed a prostitute, now shared the empire's throne. This underlying tension exploded in the year 532 in one of the bloodiest episodes in Byzantine history, the Nika riots. The political climate was already unstable. The empire grappled with high taxes, corruption, and a populace increasingly weary of palatial extravagance. In January of that year, a revolt erupted on the streets fueled by an unprecedented event. The two rival hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens, united under a single cry. The word Nika, meaning conquer, resounded like thunder in Constantinople. But their goal was not merely to protest government policies. There was a far more personal target, a woman who had reached power through manipulation. To the people, Theodora symbolized the moral corruption of an empire that allowed a tainted woman to achieve imperial purple. The streets filled with smoke and fury. Rioters set entire buildings ablaze. The Senate burned and the old Hagia Sophia Basilica became an inferno of crackling wood and flames reaching the sky. Shouts of vengeance mingled with the metallic smell of blood spilled on every corner. Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, turned into a battlefield. Justinian himself, besieged in the palace, buckled under the weight of the crisis. His closest advisors, terrified by the scale of the violence, begged him to flee. The imperial treasury was already being loaded onto ships ready to sail, and the idea of abandoning the capital seemed the only way out. But they hadn't accounted for the voice that would change the course of history. In the midst of this desperate council, Theodora rose clad in purple silken robes. Her gaze burned like ancient fire. She spoke calmly, but each word cut through the room like a sword. "This is no time to flee, even if it means saving one's life," she declared. Then with a solemn gesture, she uttered the phrase that would go down in history, "Purple makes a fine shroud." The silence that followed was absolute. What was fear to others was an opportunity to her. From childhood, she had learned to face hostile crowds, to master the chaos of shouts and stares. In that moment, she used the same psychology she had perfected in the Hippodrome to turn the fury of the masses into a spectacle and the spectacle into a weapon. Now, instead of being the crowd's victim, she was the one who would decide the fate of thousands. Justinian, mesmerized by his wife's resolve, made his final decision. He would not flee. He ordered his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to trap the rioters in the place where it all began, the Hippodrome. The plan was as simple as it was brutal. Over 100,000 people filled the arena, convinced they were celebrating the rebellion's victory. They proclaimed Hypatius, the nephew of a former emperor, Anastasius, as the new ruler. The atmosphere was jubilant, but it was the joy of the condemned. Suddenly, the exits were sealed with iron gates. Imperial troops positioned themselves around the stadium. What followed was a methodical slaughter. Soldiers advanced through the stands and arena, with swords and spears, killing regardless of sex or age. The roar of celebration turned into screams of terror. The stones of the Hippodrome, which once vibrated with applause for obscene spectacles, now soaked up the cries of agony from an entire populace. The arena that had once held the tears of a child, Theodora, was now flooded with an unimaginable amount of blood. As night fell, a deathly silence descended. Over 30,000 bodies lay in heaps in the same place where decades earlier Theodora had been displayed as a victim. The irony was as macabre as it was perfect. The place that symbolized her humiliation became the theater of her vengeance. From that day forward, no one doubted Theodora's authority. The Nika massacre not only secured Justinian's throne, but solidified the power of a woman who had learned to turn pain into a weapon and humiliation into domination. The people trembled at the sound of her name, knowing that behind her gaze lay the memory of every wrong she had suffered and the will to repay it tenfold. After the Hippodrome massacre, Theodora was not merely remembered as the wife of an emperor who refused to flee. In the eyes of the people in the court, she became Byzantium's most terrifying woman. The massacre showed she could decide the fate of tens of thousands with a single glance. But what followed revealed that her true power lay not in armies, but in her ability to rule from the shadows. While Justinian presided over audiences in the grand halls of the palace surrounded by senators and ambassadors, Theodora wove her true web of power in private chambers. There, in discreet rooms and shadowed corridors, she operated a system that could be called a proto-intelligence agency. She used eunuchs, trusted maids, and courtwomen to gather confessions, gossip, and secrets. Nothing escaped her control. Who was sleeping with whom? Which senator hid shameful inclinations? Which bishop conducted suspicious correspondence with the empire's enemies? The protocol she introduced shocked many. She demanded that anyone appearing before the emperors prostrate themselves and kiss not only Justinian's feet, but hers as well. This was not reverence, it was domination. It was the public humiliation of the most powerful men reversed with the same precision with which she herself had been humiliated in childhood. With this web of information, she launched a series of political vendettas that marked her reign with fire. Her first major victim was Pope Silverius. In the year 537, the Pope refused to reinstate a bishop favorable to the Monophysites, a faith Theodora passionately supported. She didn't debate theology or try to persuade him with arguments. She applied what She had learned in the Hippodrome she exploited men's fears. Through Belisarius and his wife Antonina, she fabricated a false conspiracy of treason. Silverius was accused of collaborating with the Goths and exiled where he died. Next came Queen Amalasuntha of the Ostrogoths. In the year 535, Theodora saw in her a greater threat than the Pope. She was young, nobly born, and corresponded with Justinian. Theodora saw in those letters more than diplomacy, she detected admiration and intimacy. She recognized the threat, because she herself was a master of those techniques. She too had won Justinian with a blend of intellect and seduction. To neutralize her, she encouraged King Theodahad to eliminate his own cousin. The crime was symbolic. Amalasuntha was murdered during a bath in a moment of utmost vulnerability. A death both intimate and humiliating, an exact mirror of the practices that had shaped Theodora. Her boldest strike came against John the Cappadocian, the Praetorian prefect, and one of the few men immune to her charms. John was a shrewd politician who understood manipulation better than anyone, making him a formidable opponent. Theodora didn't try to seduce him. Instead, she used the same psychological torture techniques she had endured in childhood. For months, she tormented him with macabre gifts, wilted flowers suggesting death, small knives evoking violence, paintings depicting executions. John began to suffer the same things she had in childhood: sleeplessness, paranoia, fear of the smallest shadow. When his mind was weakened, Theodora and Antonina set the final trap. They used his daughter as bait in a fabricated conspiracy. Spies recorded every compromising word, and soon the powerful prefect was accused of treason. From the luxuries of power, he descended to wandering the streets of Egypt as a beggar. An absolute fall designed with the cold precision of someone who knew that any mind could be broken with the right techniques. A terrifying pattern emerged from these intrigues. Theodora didn't just eliminate enemies, she destroyed them, recreating in them the same wounds that had marked her. She didn't seek mere political revenge, but applied to each opponent a pedagogy of suffering she had learned in childhood. She turned her rivals into reflections of her own past, forcing them to experience the humiliation, desperation, and psychological breakdown she had turned into a weapon. The entire empire grew accustomed to living under Theodora's invisible eye. Her enemies knew no secret was safe, that any weakness could be used against them, and that the empress could destroy careers, reputations, and lives with the same ease as an actress changing masks on stage. The Byzantium of Justinian and Theodora was in reality a theater of shadows where the absolute protagonist was no longer a victim, but a predator. Theodora's power didn't wane after the massacres or court intrigues. On the contrary, it found its greatest expression in the laws that transformed the heart of the empire. Her mark was left on the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal work that for centuries formed the foundation of Western law. It was not just a collection of norms, but a translation into ink and parchment of a life marked by violence and manipulation. Among her most significant reforms were those aimed at forced prostitution. She, who had been a slave of the Hippodrome, decreed that no woman could be coerced into practicing it, and brothel owners who tried to restrict their workers' freedom were to be harshly punished. She also ordered the closure of establishments that practiced the same exploitation she had endured. These decrees seemed like acts of justice, a personal revenge on the system that had destroyed her childhood. Yet at the same time, these measures were marked by contradiction. She established the Metanoia monastery, where rescued prostitutes were forcibly confined to lead a religious life. In this way, control over other women's bodies continued, albeit under a pious guise. It was as if Theodora wanted to ensure no one could repeat her path, but at the cost of binding them to another form of discipline. Laws regarding marriage and divorce also bore her stamp. She expanded women's rights to separate from abusive husbands, transferred the property of rapists to their victims, and established the death penalty for rapists regardless of their social status. These decisions not only reflected a pursuit of justice, but also the indelible trace of every act of violence she had suffered. Better than anyone, she knew how male power could destroy lives, and so she resolved to anchor in law a vengeance that seemed destined to endure. Dynastic control was another of her obsessions. She orchestrated strategic marriages, rewarded allies of her cause, and punished those who resisted. She ensured that the manipulation she wielded over Justinian became a legacy for future generations, a web of family alliances that would preserve her name and influence long after her death. In the year 548, at just 48 years old, Theodora fell gravely ill, likely with cancer. Her death was not merely the passing of an empress, it was the fall of a mind that had sustained Justinian's reign. The emperor, deeply dependent on her, never remarried. For the next 17 years, he ruled but without the strength, vision, or cunning that had characterized his reign alongside Theodora. His spirit seemed broken, as if the true engine of the empire had vanished with her. Chronicles note that few significant laws were enacted after her death, as if the legislative genius had always resided in the woman who stood by his side. The void was so stark that even the memory of her enemies acknowledged that Theodora was more than an emperor's wife. She was the hidden soul of Byzantium. Artistic depictions also affirmed her ambition for eternity. In the mosaics of San Vitale in Ravenna, she is portrayed larger than other figures in a cloak embroidered with the scene of the three magi bringing gifts to Christ. She placed herself in iconography on par with biblical royalty, claiming a place not only in political history, but also in spiritual history. Today, tourists visit the Hippodrome, where a 10-year-old girl was displayed as a toy for the crowd, and where years later, 30,000 rebels were ordered massacred. This contrast encapsulates her life, from humiliated victim to ruthless empress, from an object of exploitation to an absolute predator. Her story poses a troubling question. Was Theodora a heroine who used her pain to change laws and protect other women? Or was she an avenger who turned humiliation into cruel and bloody power? Perhaps she was both at once, for the truth is that the barbaric practices that should have destroyed her instead created the most dangerous and fascinating woman in Byzantine history.